Okay, so you want to own a furniture factory. Buy an old brick building, fill it with saws and sanders, hire some craftsmen, and start turning cheap lumber into expensive sofas. That's the picture in your head. You build a table for $80 in materials, you sell it for $900, and you pocket the difference. Honest work. Real things made by real hands. The kind of business your grandfather would have respected. Here's the problem. Almost none of that is how this business actually works. Let's start with the illusion, because the illusion is doing a lot of work here. Furniture is enormous. The global furniture market moves somewhere north of $700 billion a year. And in the United States alone, people spend well over $250 billion annually on the stuff they sit on, sleep on, and eat off of. Every single house needs it. Every office, every hotel, every restaurant, every dorm room. Demand never goes to zero, because human beings refuse to stand up all day. Big numbers. The kind of numbers that make a normal person walk through a showroom, flip a price tag, do some quick mental math, and think, I want in. But here's the part nobody tells you. A typical furniture manufacturer, after every cost is accounted for, keeps somewhere between 3% and 7% of revenue as actual profit. Not 40%. Not the $900 table minus $80 in wood. 3 to 7. Build and sell $1,000 worth of furniture, and if everything goes right, the factory clears somewhere between $30 and $70 once the wood, the glue, the labor, the freight, the finishing, the warehouse, and the returns are all paid for. So how does a business with margins that thin build entire dynasties, put whole towns to work, and turn a few families into people who own private jets? That's the entire question this video is going to answer. And the answer has almost nothing to do with the furniture itself. Let's start with what you're actually buying into. Because furniture factory is one of those phrases that describes about 4 completely different businesses that happen to share a loading dock. There are 4 doors you can walk through, and each one is a different animal wearing the same sawdust. The first door is case goods. That's the industry term for furniture made of hard materials. Tables, dressers, cabinets, bookshelves, bed frames. Wood, particle board, veneer. It's capital heavy and machine heavy. You're running saws, CNC routers, edge banders, and finishing lines. The margins per piece are thin, the products are heavy and expensive to ship, and you are competing directly against a container coming off a boat from Vietnam that was built by someone earning a fraction of your labor rate. The second door is upholstery. Sofas, chairs, sectionals, anything with foam and fabric stretched over a frame. This one is stubbornly labor-intensive because no machine has ever fully replaced a skilled person cutting and sewing and stapling fabric around a curve. That's exactly why a huge amount of upholstery is still made in America, in and around a single county in Mississippi and the old furniture belt of North Carolina, while most of the wood furniture sailed overseas decades ago. The third door is contract furniture, and write this one down because we're coming back to it. Contract means you don't sell to people. You sell to institutions. Hotels furnishing 400 rooms at once. Corporate offices. Universities. Hospitals. Restaurant chains. It is boring. It is unglamorous. Nobody makes a documentary about the guy who supplies the nightstands to a Marriott, and it is where a shocking amount of the real money quietly lives. The fourth door is ready to assemble, or RTA. The flat pack world. The stuff you carry out of a warehouse store in a cardboard box and build with an Allen wrench and a growing sense of despair. IKEA built one of the largest furniture empires on Earth on this single idea. Rock-bottom margins per item, but volume so enormous it bends the entire supply chain around it. So already, before you've spent a single dollar, the shape of the business is telling you something. Each door demands a different factory, a different customer, and a different way of surviving a bad year. Get the door wrong, and no amount of craftsmanship saves you. Now, let's talk about what it actually costs to get through any of those doors. This is where the fantasy usually dies. Because the romantic version of this business, a few artisans in an airy workshop, doesn't scale, and the version that does scale is brutally expensive to stand up. A serious mid-sized furniture plant needs somewhere between $3 million and $20 million just to become operational, depending on which door you picked. It starts with the building. You need a big flat industrial space. We're talking 80,000 to 300,000 square feet, with the ceiling height, the loading docks, the three-phase electrical power, and the dust collection and ventilation systems that furniture production legally and physically requires. Wood dust is explosive. That's not a metaphor. Sawdust suspended in the air is genuinely combustible. So you're installing industrial dust collection and fire suppression before you cut a single board. Then comes the machinery, and this is where the numbers get uncomfortable. A single industrial CNC router, the computer control machine that cuts panels to precise shapes, runs $80,000 to $300,000. A panel saw, an edge bander, a wide belt sander, a boring machine, each one is tens of thousands of dollars. If you're doing solid wood, you need a kiln to dry your lumber, because green wood that hasn't been dried to the right moisture content will warp, crack, and destroy your reputation one wobbling table at a time. A commercial lumber kiln is hundreds of thousands of dollars on its own. And the finishing line, the ovens and spray booths where stain and lacquer get applied, is a whole regulated environment, because you're now dealing with flammable solvents and air quality permits. Add it all up, machinery, install, and the electrical work to feed it, and you can spend $2 million to $10 million on equipment before a single finished product exists. And that's before you've bought any wood. Which brings us to the part where the real money starts moving. Raw materials. Because in furniture, the cost of what you build the thing out of swings wildly and constantly, and it moves whether you want it to or not. Lumber prices are famously volatile. They can double in a matter of months on housing demand or a supply shock, and then collapse just as fast. Foam, the guts of every sofa and mattress, is a petroleum product, which means its price is quietly chained to the price of oil. Steel for frames and mechanisms, fabric, glue, hardware, every input has its own market and its own bad day. So you build your entire product line and price it around a certain cost of materials, and then the market moves, and suddenly the sofa you priced last quarter costs you 15% more to build this quarter, and you either eat that or you go back to your retail buyers and try to raise prices, which we'll get to, because that conversation is where a lot of factories learn who's really in charge. None of this is paid in cash, by the way. Almost every serious furniture manufacturer runs on something called a revolving line of credit, borrowing against inventory and against unpaid customer invoices to buy raw materials months before the finished furniture gets paid for. Here's the trap, because the trap in this business is brutal and specific. Furniture ties up your cash for an agonizingly long time. You buy lumber in January. You dry it, cut it, assemble it, finish it, and it sits in a warehouse. You ship it to a retailer in April, and that retailer pays you in June, July, sometimes later, because big furniture retailers are notorious for paying their suppliers on stretch terms of 60, 90, sometimes 120 days. So you've spent your money in January, and you see it again, if everything goes right, in the summer. Every day in between, that cash is trapped inside a half-finished dresser sitting on a shelf, and the interest on the money you borrowed to build it is running the entire time. Now scale that. If you're carrying millions of dollars in raw materials and finished inventory, and your average product takes 120 days to convert from wood into cash in the bank, a single slow season doesn't just cost you sales. It strands your working capital exactly when you need it to buy the next round of materials. Furniture businesses rarely die because nobody wants their product. They die because they run out of cash while waiting to get paid for product people already ordered. That's the sentence to remember. It's not a demand problem. It's a cash timing problem. So you spent millions to open the doors. You're bleeding interest on inventory that won't pay you back for 4 months. And you're competing against an ocean freighter full of cheaper sofas. How does anyone make a living doing this? Here's where the whole picture flips. Because the money isn't where you think it is. Everyone assumes the furniture maker makes their money on the furniture. That assumption is mostly wrong. The margin on the actual product, what the industry would call the front end, the physical sale of a table or a couch, has been ground down for 30 years by exactly the container off the boat. When a retailer can buy a nearly identical dresser from an overseas factory for a fraction of your cost, your pricing power on the plain product evaporates. So where does the real profit come from? The first answer is the finishing. This is the part almost nobody outside the industry understands. Two dressers can roll off the same line, built from the same particle board core, and one sells for $200 and the other sells for $1,200. The difference isn't the box. It's the finish, the hardware, the detailing, and the story wrapped around it. Finishing, the staining, distressing, lacquering, and the custom options carries dramatically higher margins than the raw construction, because it's the part the customer emotionally reacts to and the part that's hardest for a distant factory to replicate cheaply. The box is a commodity. The finish is a brand. The factories that when learned to stop selling boxes and start selling finishes. But even the finishing isn't the most profitable room in the building. That title belongs somewhere you'd never expect. It belongs to the customer you never see, the contract and private label business. Remember the third door? Here's why we came back to it. When you sell a single sofa to a single family, you fight for that sale, you pay a showroom to display it, you eat the risk that they return it, and you do it all again tomorrow for the next family. But when you win a contract to furnish a 300-room hotel, or to be the factory that secretly builds a national retailer's house brand furniture line, you get something a consumer sale never gives you: volume, predictability, and a purchase order signed months in advance. Private label, sometimes called white label, means you build the furniture and someone else's name goes on it. The big retailer designs the look, you build it, they slap their brand on it, and the customer never knows your factory exists. You give up the glory. You get the volume and the stable production schedule that lets you actually plan your materials buying and keep your expensive machines running at capacity. And a machine running at capacity is the entire game in a capital-heavy business, because that CNC router costs the same whether it runs one shift or three. Here's the mechanism that makes contract and private label so powerful. It kills the two things that murder furniture factories: idle machines and unpredictable demand. A consumer brand lurches from a great spring to a dead summer. A contract order for a hotel chain being built over 18 months gives you a smooth, bankable production line you can borrow against, staff against, and buy materials against with confidence. That's not a rounding error. That's a second business running quietly inside the first one, and it's the one paying for the building. And then there's the layer almost nobody thinks about at all: logistics. Furniture is the worst possible product to ship. It's big, it's heavy, it's fragile, and it's mostly air. A sofa is a giant box of empty space with some foam in it, and you're paying to move that empty space across the country. Freight and damage are a silent tax on this entire industry, sometimes eating 10% to 20% of a product's value by the time it reaches a customer. And every dented corner is a return, a refund, and a total loss. Which is exactly why the smart operators obsess over it. This is the entire genius of ready-to-assemble furniture. Flatpack doesn't just save the customer money. It lets you ship 4 times as many units in the same truck, because you're no longer paying to transport empty space. The factories that figured out how to ship denser, break less, and control their own delivery didn't just cut a cost. They turned their single biggest liability into a moat that the overseas competitor, sitting on the far end of a 5-week ocean voyage, can never fully cross. None of this means the business is safe. It's leverage from top to bottom, and leverage cuts in both directions. Because you borrow against inventory and unpaid invoices, an increase in interest rates doesn't just make your loans more expensive. It hits at the exact moment your customers, human beings, start pulling back. And furniture is one of the most brutally cyclical purchases in the entire economy. Nobody needs a new sofa. When money gets tight, replacing the couch is the single easiest decision on earth to postpone for another year. Furniture demand is chained directly to the housing market. People buy furniture when they move, and when home sales freeze because mortgage rates spiked, furniture sales freeze right behind them. So higher rates raise your carrying costs and kill your demand at the same instant. It's a squeeze from both sides at once. Then there's the thing that has reshaped this entire industry more than any recession: trade policy. A single government decision thousands of miles away can rewrite your business overnight. When the United States imposed anti-dumping duties on Chinese wooden bedroom furniture back in the mid-2000s, and later when broad tariffs landed on Chinese goods, it didn't save the American factories the way you'd expect. Production didn't come home. It just sailed to the next cheapest coastline: Vietnam, Malaysia, Indonesia. Vietnam went from a minor player to one of the largest furniture exporters to America in about a decade, built almost entirely on furniture fleeing tariffs somewhere else. If you built your whole business plan around a tariff protecting you, you learned a hard lesson. The tariff doesn't protect the factory, it just reshuffles which foreign factory wins. And if you're the American plant that invested millions betting the tariff would hold your prices up, you don't get that money back when the production simply relocates one country over. There's also a quieter, more personal killer in this business: single customer dependency. Picture the factory that lands the dream account. A giant national retailer, or one of the big players like an Ashley or a Wayfair or a Williams-Sonoma, decides to buy from you. Suddenly, that one buyer is 60% of your revenue. It feels like you've made it. Here's the trap. The moment one customer is most of your business, you no longer own your business. They do. They dictate your price. They dictate your terms. They stretch your payments to 90 days knowing you can't say no. And the day they decide to resource the product to a cheaper factory in Vietnam, your entire plant goes dark over a single phone call. Dozens of furniture makers have been built up and then hollowed out by exactly this. Not by losing customers, but by winning one too big to survive losing. So how do experienced owners protect themselves against all of this? They stop thinking like a woodshop and start thinking like a supply chain. The single most powerful move in modern furniture manufacturing is vertical integration, owning more of the chain instead of just the middle of it. The factories that quietly get rich are the ones that don't just build furniture. They control the pieces around the furniture. Some own their own lumber supply or foam production. So when input prices spike, they're buying from themselves instead of bleeding out to a supplier. Some, like Lazy Boy, built their own retail stores and delivery networks. So they capture the retail margin and the manufacturer margin at once. And they own the customer relationship instead of renting it from a retailer who can drop them. Some built their entire empire on logistics. Ashley Furniture became the largest furniture manufacturer in the world in large part by obsessively controlling its own distribution and shipping, turning the industry's worst cost center into its sharpest weapon. And the very best operators do the thing that sounds boring and is actually the whole secret. They diversify their customers on purpose. They deliberately keep any single buyer under a set percentage of revenue. They run a mix of consumer brand, contract, and private label at the same time, and they keep their expensive machines running at capacity across all three, so a dead season in one is covered by a signed purchase order in another. It's less glamorous than being a famous furniture brand. It's also the only version of this business built to survive a bad year, because it stacks three separate demand engines on top of each other instead of betting everything on the mood of shoppers. So after all of that, what does a furniture factory actually make? Let's do the honest math, and let's do both years, because the gap between them is the whole story. Here's the good year. You run a mid-sized plant doing $40 million in annual revenue with a healthy mix: consumer brand, a fat hotel contract, and a private label line for a national retailer. Materials come in cheap because lumber and foam had a calm year, so your cost of goods runs where you planned it. Your machines run near full capacity across 2 shifts, which means the enormous fixed cost of that building and those CNC routers gets spread across a huge number of units, and your per unit cost drops. Freight damage stays low because you invested in better packaging. You net 7% of that $40 million. That's $2.8 million of profit on a machine that's humming, with a signed contract backlog stretching into next year that you can borrow against and plan around. That's a genuinely great business. Now here's the bad year. The housing market freezes because mortgage rates jumped and consumer furniture orders dropped 20% almost overnight. At the exact same time, lumber spikes 30% on a supply shock and foam climbs with the price of oil, so every unit you build costs more precisely as demand falls. Your machines drop to 1 shift, which means that same fixed building cost is now spread across far fewer units, and your per unit cost balloons even before the material spike. The big retailer that was 40% of your revenue uses the soft market as leverage to demand a price cut and stretches you to 120 days on payment, so your cash gets trapped even longer. You've got millions in raw materials and finished inventory sitting in a warehouse, financed on a line of credit whose interest rate just went up, waiting for buyers who postponed. That same $40 million plant can swing from $2.8 million in profit to a multi-million-dollar loss in a single year, and the thing that pushes it over the edge is almost never demand disappearing. It's running out of cash while waiting to get paid. The difference between those 2 years for the identical building with the identical machines and the identical craftsmen can be $5, $6, $7 million. And it's driven almost entirely by 3 things you cannot control: interest rates, commodity prices, and the housing market. That's the volatility trap. The costs are relentless, and they arrive daily. The revenue is cyclical, seasonal, and stretched out on someone else's payment terms. So is it worth it? This isn't a business for someone without serious capital and iron nerves, and it isn't the honest little woodshop from the fantasy under any definition. It demands millions in machinery before you sell a single chair, a working capital line deep enough to survive 4 months between spending and getting paid, and total exposure to commodity swings and trade decisions made by people who owe you nothing. You're managing a shop floor, a spray booth full of flammable solvents, a freight operation, and a negotiation with a retail buyer who knows exactly how badly you need the order, all inside the same building. But for the people who make it through that gauntlet, furniture turns out to be one of the most durable manufacturing businesses in the entire economy, precisely because the world can never stop needing a place to sit. When the consumer brand goes quiet in a recession, the hotel contract keeps the machines running. When lumber spikes, the vertically integrated owner who bought his own supply barely feels it. When the overseas factory undercuts your price, the operator who owns his freight and his finishing and his retail relationship still wins, because he was never really selling the box. Because that's the thing the fantasy gets exactly backwards. You pictured a business that makes money by turning wood into furniture. The furniture was never the product. The furniture is the thing that carries the real business, the finish, the contract, the freight, and the brand, out the loading dock and into the world. The factory that understands that gets rich slowly, one full truck at a time. The factory that thinks its selling tables goes broke, waiting to get paid for them.